So our speaker tonight, Chuck Greaves, was born in Levittown, New York. Graduate with honors from the University of Southern California. I'm from North Carolina, so I was going to say South Carolina. And Boston College Law School. Spent 25 years as a trial lawyer in Los Angeles and was a frequent contributor to LA Lawyer magazine. In addition, he was the president of the Pasadena Public Library Association. And then I believe around age 50, I won't say midlife crisis, but if so, that'd be a compliment because you're going to hit 100. But he decided to go the John Grisham route and turn to writing, and has had, as you can see, quite a success in that regard, without the benefit of quote unquote formal writing education. I imagine briefs 25 years of briefs definitely helped you to organize your thoughts. But as you can see here, seven novels to date. The first four are of the from the Jack McTaggart series. Hush Money, which won our own Southwest Writers International Writing Contest Award. Green Lady, which was described as the wickedest read of the year by New York Times bestselling author Douglas Preston. And then The Last Heir and the Chimera Club were both finalists for the Colorado Book Awards, and the latter won the Colorado Authors League 2023 award for Best Mystery Novel. In addition, with Hard Twisted at the very end there, and I guess there's like two, four, yeah. Hard Twisted was a true crime based upon a novel based upon a true crime back in the Depression era. And then Tom and Lucky and George and Cokie Flo, coverage of the 1936 trial of Lucky Luciano. For these, he's been awarded the Lefty for Left Coast Writers Awards, the Seamus, the Private Eye Writers of America give that one out, McCavity, which is bestowed by the Mystery Readers International, and then again he's won New Mexico, Arizona, Oklahoma, and Colorado Book Awards. So he's wrapping up the entire Southwest there, as well as Harper Lee Prize for legal fiction. So without further ado, I'll let him speak for himself and take it away.
Thank you, Dan. Hopefully everybody can hear me all right.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes. Yes.
All right, great. By way of introduction or further introduction, I was a lawyer for 25 years in Los Angeles. And in 2006, I did have a midlife crisis. And I decided that I was going to stop being a lawyer, and I was instead going to do what I always had wanted to do, which is to become a novelist. And so I resigned my law firm partnership. My very understanding wife, who was also a lawyer, did the same. And we relocated from Los Angeles to Santa Fe in 2006. And I set up a little writing office in the corner of our bedroom. I started to work on my first novel, and it was going to be a first-person whodunit. The protagonist was going to be a younger version of myself, a young lawyer from Pasadena, from a blue-collar background, who went to work at a white shoe law firm and becomes involved in a convoluted murder mystery. It took me 2 years to write the novel, which I called Hush Money. At the end of those 2 years, I did what all, I think, first-time novelists do, which is I started sending out query letters to New York literary agents, hoping to gain representation. I probably wrote about 30 query letters, and I probably received about 30 form rejection letters back in the mail. I then, while going through that process, started writing my second novel. My second novel was a completely different undertaking. It was an historical novel based on true events, set in Dust Bowl, Oklahoma, told from the point of view of a 13-year-old girl whose been kidnapped by her father's murderer and taken on a crime and killing spree across the American Southwest. That book was called Hard Twisted. It took me 2 years to write that book. So it was now 2010. I had 2 complete manuscripts. I had no agent and no publisher. My wife said, "You're not going to write another novel until you sell one of the first 2." So I somehow it came to my attention that there were some writing contests out there in the world, one of which was called the Tony Hilliman Prize, which was given to the best first novel set in the American Southwest. And since Hush Money was set in Los Angeles, I figured that's the American Southwest. I submitted my manuscript to the Tony Hilliman Prize contest. The other contest I read about was by SouthWest writers. And back in those days, back in 2010, the SouthWest Writers International Writing Contest was quite a large contest. In fact, the year that I entered in 2010, there were over 680 entries in 14 different categories. And so for the novel categories, I think you submitted your first 20 or 30 pages, which I did. With Hush Money, the mystery, I submitted to the best mystery category. And with Hard Twisted, the historical novel, I submitted to the best historical novel category. And a month or so went by, and I had an email one day from SouthWest Writers congratulating me and saying that my novel Hush Money was one of 3 finalists in the mystery category. And then a few days later, I got a second email from SouthWest Writers telling me that my novel Hard Twisted was a finalist in the historical novel category and inviting me to attend their annual awards dinner. I had no idea what to expect. I had some friends in town from Los Angeles, and I almost didn't go. I said, "Do you want to go do this thing with me?" And they said, "Yeah, let's go." So we went down to Albuquerque, not knowing what to expect. It turned out it was a lovely event. There were probably 200 people there. It was a part of a large writers conference at that time. There were editors and agents speaking. And then they did an Academy Award type presentation for the different categories. All the categories were blind judged. And when the best mystery category came up, they announced 3rd place, 2nd place, and congratulations to Chuck Greaves for Hush Money. Then when the historical novel category came up, they said 3rd place, 2nd place, congratulations to Chuck Greaves for his novel Hard Twisted. What they then did was they took the 14 category winners, and in a separate round of blind judging, they announced the grand prize storyteller award. And the Betsy James was the guest judge, and she said, "Well, it came down to a coin toss between 2 entries, but I decided the winner should be Chuck Greaves for Hush Money." I later was told by Betsy that the other book was Hard Twisted, so I was able to claim at least that I came in 1st and 2nd in the contest. I immediately went home and sent emails to the few agents who still had one or the other book under submission. And I said, "By the way, Hush Money just won the SouthWest Writers International Writing Contest. So I hope you'll read it and get back to me." A few weeks went by, and I was sitting in my office revising Hard Twisted, the 2nd novel, when the phone rang. And it was a young agent from the David Black Agency in New York calling me to say how she'd read both novels and she would be honored to represent me. So after 5 years of knocking my head against the wall, here was the phone call I'd been waiting for. And during that half-hour phone conversation, an email popped up on my laptop from a different agent that said, "Agency contract enclosed." So within the course of about 10 minutes, I had not 1 but 2 agency offers, and all thanks to SouthWest Writers. And I've always, in the acknowledgments to my novels, and anytime I speak in public, I always make it a point to thank SouthWest Writers for launching my writing career. By the way, the other contest, the Tony Hillman Prize, about 2 weeks after signing with the David Black Agency, I had another phone call from Peter Joseph, who was the editor from St. Martin's Press, calling to say, Chuck, you didn't win the Hillman Prize, but we liked your novel well enough, we'd like to publish it. My agent was able to sell Hush Money as a multi-book deal to St. Martin's, and she was able to sell Hard Twisted, a historical novel, to Bloomsbury, and both novels were published in 2012, and that's how I became a published author. What I want to talk about tonight, and I apologize to the memoirists out there, my talk tonight is going to mostly focus on writing the novel. I've broken it down into 5 headings if you want to follow along. And they are deciding what novel to write, preparing to write, key threshold decisions you need to make before writing, and there are 4 of those, then writing the novel, and then revising the novel you've written. So that's our outline for this evening, starting with deciding what novel to write. So I wanted to be a novelist, okay? And by the way, tonight I'm going to tell you the lessons I learned, and more importantly, the lessons I wish I'd been taught when I embarked on trying to become a novelist. And I also want to say up front, there's no one way to do any of this. There are hundreds of little decisions that you have to make in the course of writing a novel, and there's no one right way to do it. The right way to do it is whatever way works best for you. What I will tell you is things that work for me, things that I know from speaking with writer friends, things that work for them. So we'll talk about those. But the thing to always remember is I can't tell you how to do it. You have to figure out what works for you, and hopefully with a little bit of guidance. So, okay, you've decided to write a novel. The first question is, what kind of novel are you going to write? For me, it was an easy decision. I had been a lawyer, and I figured I'd use that to my advantage, and I would write about, my protagonist would be a young version of myself, a young lawyer in Pasadena. And I always enjoyed reading mysteries, so it seemed natural to me that you should write what you enjoy reading, and I think that's good advice. But even better advice is you need to write what you can see yourself writing successfully. I mean, it's one thing to want or to enjoy reading a certain type of novel. I enjoy reading lyrical literary fiction, but I could no more sit down and write a book like The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, or a complex intra-family book like the kind that Jonathan, what's his name, writes. As much as I admire that kind of writing, Jonathan Franzen, I could never write that. And I know I could never write that kind of novel, and I'm not even going to try. But I enjoyed reading mysteries, and I thought, I could write a mystery. I loved Nelson DeMille, for example, one of my favorite mystery writers. And I read his books, and I say, I could write a book like this. And so that's what I set out to do. And that leads us to the advice that many authors receive, which is, or first-time novelists, which is to write what you know. Often that advice is given as kind of a straw man to say, yeah, you write what you know, but really you shouldn't, because obviously if you write science fiction, you're not writing what you know, you're making it out of whole cloth. All that's true, but to the extent that you can take your personal experiences and use them in service of your novel, it's a good idea to do that, to write what you know. For one thing, it's going to save you a lot of time when it comes to research. In my first novel, the legal thriller, I didn't have to do any research. It was simple. I knew the character, I knew the setting, I knew the milieu. I was able to sit down and just start writing. The second novel, written from the point of view of a 13-year-old girl in Dust Bowl, Oklahoma, I knew nothing about her life. And writing that book involved literally years of research that I've been doing up to the point that I started writing. So if you write what you know, You'll save on research if nothing else. Another thing that I learned in the course of writing all my novels is that you really need to enjoy the kind of book that you're writing, and you really need to like the characters that you've created in your book, because you're going to be living with those characters and living with that novel basically every day for however long it takes you to write that novel. It takes me about 2 years to write a novel. And when I write, I try to write every day. And we'll talk about writing schedules a little bit later. But basically, when I'm at the computer writing the novel, I'm into the novel. When I'm laying in bed at night, I'm thinking about the novel. When I'm going jogging, I'm thinking about the novel. I'm thinking about what I've written and what I might yet write, or what I might write better. When I wake up in the morning, I'm thinking about that novel. For me, at least, I'm immersed in my writing while I'm writing it. And if you don't enjoy the kind of writing you're doing, and you don't enjoy the characters you've created, and you're not having fun with it, it's going to be a long 2 years. So, yeah, write the kind of novel you want to write, create the kind of characters you want to spend time with. That's my first piece of advice. Another piece of advice is whatever you do, don't try to write to the market. Okay. When I started writing in 2006, I think vampire novels were all the rage. Okay. And if I wanted to chase what I thought was a publishable novel, I might have tried to write a vampire novel. Here's why that's a real bad idea. For one thing, it's going to take you anywhere from 1 to 3 years to actually write the novel. Then, in my case, it took me, a year or more to find an agent. It takes the agent a certain amount of time to sell the novel. Once the publisher acquires the novel, it takes them a year to actually put it out. Okay. So that novel that I started writing in 2006 was published in 2012. And I can assure you that vampire novels were not all the rage in 2012. So if I tried to write to the market as it existed in 2006, I'd be out of luck in 2012. You can never predict what the market's going to be a year from now, 2 years from now. So whatever you do, don't try to write to the market. Write the novel that you want to write and that you think you can write. All right. Item 2 in the outline, preparing to write. You should read extensively within your genre that you're going to write. If you want to write a romance novel, and by all means, Google the 10 best romance novels of all time and read them. See what's already been done. See what's been successful for other authors. See what the tropes are in the genre. Okay. And familiarize yourself with the kind of book you're going to write. Doesn't mean you're going to try to write the same type of book, but it helps you to know what the tropes are. And at least that way, if you're going to try something new or different, at least you'll know you're deviating from what's been successful and what's accepted in the past. Second item is research. Like I said, my legal mystery didn't require a lot of research. The other book required a ton of research. And research, unfortunately, is something that most of us have to do with the novels that we write. By way of example, when I wrote the first draft of my Dust Bowl story, it begins at least mostly in East Texas, on the Red River border with Oklahoma. I'd never been there. I had no idea what it looked like. So when I wrote the first draft of the novel, in my head I was picturing West Texas, kind of flat and bare and arid, tumbleweed rolling across the plain type of thing. And I wrote the whole novel that way. And then for the second draft, I decided, I better go and actually look at this place. So I got on a plane and I flew to Dallas and I drove to Paris, Texas, and I visited all the locations. It was a true story. So I visited all the locations that I was writing about: Hugo, Oklahoma; Roebuck Lake, Oklahoma; the courthouses in Texas; Paris, Texas; a place called Peerless, Texas. Lo and behold, it was nothing like I imagined. That part of Texas is rolling and green and beautiful with a lot of flowing water. So when I went back and revised the novel, I was able to reimagine it. And that's the kind of research that that I'd urge you to do. And happily today, you don't have to get on a plane and fly to Texas to do research. You've got Google at your fingertips, and you can literally go anywhere now on Google Earth, and you can see and get a sense of what a place looks like. Um, I know Los Angeles fairly well. I lived there for 30 years, but when I was writing my last novel, The Chimera Club, I'd set a scene at a particular intersection, and I had no idea what that intersection looked like. You can go on Google, you can download whatever they call it, Street View, and you can do a 360-degree circle and see every building, see how many lanes there are in the road, or whatever, and you can write that scene without leaving your office, which is a tremendous advantage that writers have today that wasn't always the case. Um, you might want to try reading a book on writing. Okay, there are plenty of books out there on how to write the novel. If you Google it, you'll probably find dozens, if not hundreds, of books on how to write the novel, and there are a lot of really good ones. I read Bird by Bird by Annie Lamott. I thought that was good. It was a little bit esoteric, not exactly a nitty-gritty how-to book. The book that I found, I read 4 or 5 books on how to write the novel before I started to write my first novel. The one that I thought was fantastic and I recommend to everybody, well, 2 actually, is a book called Screenplay. Screenplay has nothing to do with writing the novel. It has to do with writing screenplays. But it's a masterclass in storytelling. And you'll learn all about 3-act structure, which we'll talk about a little bit later, character arc, the same types of things that apply equally to both screenwriting and to writing the novel. Screenplay is the kind of the holy Bible of screenwriting by Sid Field. This is probably the 2nd volume. It's up to, I don't know, 12th or whatever edition at this point. It's still very popular. But the book I really recommend is called Writing the Novel by Lawrence Block. This is the 1st edition. I know a 2nd edition came out a couple of years ago. It's a fantastic book because it's a real how-to. And again, what Block tells you is not how to do it or how he thinks you should do it. He'll talk about, here's what the issue is. Here are the things you need to think about. Here's the way I happen to do it, but you don't need to do it that way. Here's how friends of mine handle these issues. You have to decide what works best for you. So I think he takes a really useful and positive approach to writing, and it's an excellent book, Writing the Novel by Lawrence Block. All right, so you've done your research, you've decided what novel you want to write, you've read within the genre, you've done your research, you've read maybe a book or 2 on writing the novel, and you're ready to go. You're sitting in front of your word processor, the cursor is blinking, you're not ready yet. There are I submit 4 key threshold decisions you need to make before you ever type chapter 1. And here's what they are. Are you going to outline your novel, or are you just going to start writing and wing it? Okay, true story. The first writers conference I ever attended was the Tony Hillerman Writers Conference, back when it was still held in Albuquerque. I think it was in 2006 or 2007. And one of the first speakers was Craig Johnson. Craig Johnson writes the Walt Longmire mysteries. And Craig Johnson said, you need to outline. Trying to write a novel without outlining is like getting in your car in Los Angeles and driving to New York without a map. You're probably going to get there, but it's going to take you twice as long. You're going to get lost time and again along the way. And you really need to have an outline. That's your map from getting from LA to New York. Otherwise, you're wasting a lot of time. And I dutifully wrote that down. The next speaker was Michael McGarry. Michael McGarry said, never outline. It's the worst thing you can do. It sucks all the spontaneity out of the process. You're better off just starting to write and have your character and follow your character, and he'll tell you where to go. It's an organic process, and you'll ruin it by outlining. Okay, so what do you do? The fact is they're both right. Okay, it's whatever works for you. And I've talked to a lot of writers on this topic, and they all fall somewhere on a spectrum between being assiduous outliners to being complete seat of the pants writers. Um, most most writers, in my experience, outline to some extent. Okay, the ones who outline assiduously, they will take their novel, break it into however many chapters they're going to write, 20 or 30 chapters, let's say, and they'll write maybe a paragraph for each chapter. And they'll do it that way all the way through the book. And they'll plot the whole book out that way. And when they sit down to write, they'll know exactly what they need to cover in that chapter, and so on. Even the writers like me, who write by the seat of their pants, it helps to know what your starting point is, what your ending point is, and at least two key plot points you're going to hit along the way. If you have those in mind, I submit that's enough to begin writing, if that's the way you want to do it. I don't have the patience to outline. I would go crazy outlining. If I did outline, I guarantee you that by about chapter 4, the outline would be out the window, because my writing would have taken me somewhere totally different. So it makes no sense for me to outline. The way I think of it is my first draft is my outline. Okay. I sit down and I write from the seat of my pants, beginning to end. When I'm done, I have my manuscript around 80,000 words. And at that point, I can revise, I can move things around, I can add or subtract. I can do whatever I need to do with that first draft. That's what works for me. You need to figure out what works for you and go with that. Second threshold question or decision you need to make before you start writing is past tense or present tense. Now, that's a fairly easy one because most novels are written in the past tense. I would suggest that you do it that way. Writing in the present tense, I do some screenwriting in addition to novel writing. The convention of screenwriting is that you write in the present tense. So I have experience writing in the present tense. When I read a novel written in the present tense, I find it off-putting a little bit. Once you're into it, you kind of overlook it once you're into the story. But at least in the beginning, I find it a bit off-putting. I do have friends who write in the present tense. My friend Mark Stevens just did a very successful novel called The Fireballer. He wrote it in the present tense. I asked him why. He said because he feels there's an intimacy in the present tense, an immediacy, like you're following a story just as it's happening. And there's probably some merit to that. But most novels are written in the past tense, and I'd suggest that if you're going to write, especially for your first novel, that you do it in the past tense. Similarly, third threshold question you need to answer: first person or third person? My first novel, Hush Money, I wrote in the first person. To me, that's the most natural way to write. I think it's the way stories were always written from the beginning. When the cavemen were sitting around the campfire, they said, I did this, I did that. You know, that's the way I think people naturally tell stories. So I find that to be very natural. Because I write in the crime genre often, I submit most crime novels, most mysteries are written in the first person. Not all, but most. Conversely, I think most general or literary fiction is written in the third person. For my second novel, which is more of a literary novel, I wrote it in the third person. It felt very strange to me. It was not natural to me. But I did it, and I was glad I forced myself to do it. And I've written both in the first and third person in succeeding novels. What's the difference between the two? What are the advantages and disadvantages? I think it comes down to a question of intimacy versus flexibility. When you're writing in the first person, your characters are speaking directly to the reader. Okay, it's I walked into the room, I saw the body on the table, I did this, I did that. she said that, I said that in response. Okay, it's very intimate. Lawrence Block says, writing in the first person is like walking along the street with a friend and you got your hand on his elbow and you're telling him a story. There's intimacy in the first person. What's the downside to the first person? No flexibility. The reader can only see and experience what the first person point of view protagonist can see and hear and relate to the reader. Okay, you can't say, meanwhile, across town, this is happening. Not when you're writing in the first person. All right. Conversely, in the third person, you have great flexibility. For one thing, you're not stuck with one point of view character. You can write chapter 1 from Jack's point of view, and chapter 2 from Jill's point of view, and chapter 3 from Jack's point of view, or somebody else's point of view. You can move through space and time. You can start your next chapter, meanwhile, 7,000 miles away in Madrid. Senor, whoever opened his door, and you can jump around because you have this narrator. So instead of your character speaking directly to the reader, you have the narrator telling the reader what the character is doing or saying or thinking. Again, you sacrifice intimacy, but you gain flexibility. I've got a friend who's has a very successful series of mystery novels. He's written 8 so far, and I've read all of his manuscripts in draft before they went to the editor, and he writes in the third person. But after about 3 novels, I noticed something. He was writing in the third person, but his point of view never left his protagonist. It was always the one protagonist point of view throughout the novel. I said to him at one point, I said, Scott, since you're writing in the third person, why don't you take advantage of the flexibility there? Why don't you, use some other points of view and move your story around? And he took that advice. And starting about the 4th novel, he'd do a point of view from his protagonist, and then a point of view chapter from the wife, who was another character in all the stories, and his children, who were characters in the stories. And I felt his novels were much richer for his having taken advantage of that flexibility. The one caveat I'd say here is, if you're going to write in the third person and you're going to change points of view, which is fine, that's one of the benefits, try not to do it within a chapter. Try not to start a chapter from one person's point of view and then partway flip and switch to somebody else's point of view. I'm reading a first novel manuscript right now that somebody asked me to read. And it's a very good story, very well written, except that the writer has no concept of point of view. So he's writing in a chapter talking from Jack's, Jack is thinking this and doing this. And then the next paragraph, Jill is thinking and doing this. And then next paragraph, Jack is something. And that kind of head hopping is very distracting for the reader. And it's a signal to an editor, potentially acquiring editor, that the writer maybe doesn't have as much experience or sophistication. That's not to say it can't be done. It's been done very successfully. Ken Kesey, one of my favorite authors in the world, wrote a book called Sometimes a Great Notion. He's head hopping throughout the novel. Sometimes in the same sentence, he's switching point of view. We're not Ken Kesey, okay? So my advice to you is, if you're going to write in the third person and you're going to change points of view, do it in alternating chapters. All right. So we've made our threshold decisions. We know which person, we know which point of view. We've decided we're going to outline it or not, which tense we're going to write in. Now we're ready to write. All right. Best advice I can give a new writer is to set a routine. All right. If you have the luxury of writing full time, which I've had, my routine basically is I get up in the morning when I'm writing a novel, I have my breakfast, I go to my office, I close the door, and at 9 o'clock, I'm writing. My line is, I only write when I'm inspired, but I make it a point to be inspired every morning at 9 o'clock. Okay. I write from 9 until lunchtime. I stop and have lunch. I take a walk, I go for a run, I do whatever. I'm thinking about what I wrote during that day. I'll come back in the afternoon and I'll sit down and I'll review what I've written for that day, and I'll leave myself off in a place where I'm ready to start writing tomorrow at 9. And I try to do that when I'm writing a novel. I try to write every day, 7 days a week. If you can do that, that's great. Obviously, not everybody can do that. We have work requirements, we have childcare, whatever it is. Even if you can only spare an hour a day, please try to write for 1 hour every day. Please try to stay in the story and not walk away from it for a week and try to come back to it, because you're going to lose your train of thought. You're going to have to go back from the beginning and you work your way forward, and you're going to waste a lot of time that way. So try to set a routine and try to stick with it. Now, in my experience, most writers, when they set a routine, they base it on word count. They say, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write 1,000 words a day, let's say. And if you can do that, you can write a novel in 80 days. And the way they do it is, doesn't matter how, if it takes them an hour to write 1,000 words, they quit in an hour. If it takes them 6 struggling hours to get that 1,000 words, that's what they do. They want to get that word count, whatever it is, every single day. I don't do that. I just set my time block and I write within that time block, and whether I produce 1 page or 10 pages, that just depends on how well I'm writing that day. I'm a slow writer. If I can write a page a day, I can write a novel in a year, 365 pages in a year, okay, for a first draft. And then I'll spend, the better part of the next year revising and reworking my novel, which we'll talk about in a bit. Let's talk about openings, how to open your novel. Nicky Spillane, the great crime writer of the 1930s and 40s, he has a great line. He says, your first chapter sells the book. Your last chapter sells the next book. And truer words were never spoken. When you begin your novel, you should begin in the story. It doesn't have to be a shootout or a car chase or some, over-the-top action scene a la Indiana Jones, okay? But you should start your novel in the story and save the backstory for later. A mistake that a lot of first-time novelists make is that they think that before they can tell their story, they have to introduce their character to the reader, give you his backstory, set the stage before we can begin the story. I can't tell you how many first novel manuscripts I've read in which I didn't say to the writer, let me make a suggestion to you. Take your first paragraph and swap it with your first chapter and swap it with your second chapter. And I can't tell you how much that improves the book, because the second chapter is when the story's beginning. And then if you want to tell the reader about the background of the characters, you want to, set the table, do it in the second chapter or the third chapter or the fifth chapter. Better yet, break the backstory up and feather it throughout the rest of the story, but begin in the story. Annie Lamott, we talked about her novel Bird by Bird. She has an acronym for that. It's called ABDCE, not ABCDE, but ABDCE, and that stands for Action, Background, Development, Climax, Ending. I'm not going to go into that, but the point I want to make is she doesn't say background, action. She says action, background, development. So the same thing. Start in the story, give the background later, work it in later. Let's talk about structure, okay? You'll hear the term 3-act structure a lot when you talk about screenwriting and writing the novel. The concept is applicable to both. 3-act structure, a simple way to think about it, take think of your novel as 4 quarters, okay? In a 400-page novel, 4 100-page blocks, okay? The first 100 page is the first act. The middle 200 pages is the second act, and the last 100 pages is the third act. So the second act is twice as long as the first act and the third act, okay? And basically, the first act is the setup, the second act is the confrontation, the third act is the resolution. And what separates those 3 acts are key plot points. You need 2 key plot points in your story. And this is in genre fiction, but you'll be surprised how many works of general fiction or literary fiction still employ 3-act structure. And if you look for it, you'll see it in any movie you watch, certainly, and in most novels that you'll read. All right. So in my latest novel, The Chimera Club, the story is my lawyer protagonist, Jack McTaggart, is hired by this beautiful young woman to defend her father, who's been accused of this high-profile murder. So it opens with the woman coming to Jack's office and hiring him. And the first act is Jack doing what lawyers do, interviewing people, doing research, meeting with the district attorney to talk about the case, preparing to defend the client. And then right around page 100, right around the first quarter of the book, is the first plot point. Something happens that takes the story and stands it on its head and sends it off in a totally different direction. That's your first plot point. In the case of the Chimera Club, what happens is that Jack's client, who he's preparing to defend, is himself murdered. Okay, so Jack has to face the question: did the murderer just get murdered, or did somebody else commit both murders? And now Jack, instead of defending his client, he's now investigating who murdered his client, and indeed who's trying to murder him. And so that's the second act. And in mystery fiction, generally, the second plot point is when the crime is solved. Jack figures out who done it and why, and then the final act is how the story plays out from that point forward. The same thing applies to romance fiction. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy regains girl, whatever. 3-act structure is an effective way of telling stories. And if you look for 3-act structure, you'll see it in almost every genre novel you read, and absolutely in every movie you watch. All right. There's a thing called character arc, and this goes back to Sid Fields. And it's a very simple concept. Character arc is simply that your protagonist at the end of the novel is going to be a different person than they were when the novel began. And the reason they're going to be different is because the events described in the novel has changed your character in some way, for the better, usually, for the worse, sometimes. But there'll be a changed person at the end of the novel compared to where they were at the beginning. In a romance novel, maybe at the beginning of the story, she's a high-powered executive from New York who takes a vacation, and she meets a handsome lumberjack from her hometown, and they fall in love, and she decides that she wants to live in the forest with the lumberjack. And at the end of the romance novel, she's a changed person, okay, because of the events that have taken place during the course of the novel. When you write a serious character, as I do with my mystery novels, sometimes that character arc change is a little bit more subtle. You can't have your character completely changing in every novel in a major way, but they will change to a certain extent. They'll mature, they'll become more cynical, they'll become less cynical, whatever, during the course of each novel. So even in a series of novels, you can have character arc. Dialogue is one of my favorite things to talk about, and in fact, I'm going to teach a whole course on dialogue here in Colorado with my writing group, which is called the Four Corners Writers, next month. And there's a lot you can say about dialogue. You can spend hours talking about dialogue. I'm just going to hit some quick points on dialogue. Uh, you've heard the term dialogue tag or an attribution. Dialogue tag is when you say he said or she said at the end of a line of dialogue. Okay. Um, Here's a quick story. I had a Western writer of some repute some years ago ask if I would read his novel in progress for him. And I agreed in a moment of weakness to do that. And I was appalled because this is how he wrote dialogue. He'd say, "What shall we do today?" Jack asked. "Well, we could go to the lake," Jill replied. "Why the lake?" Jack asked. "Well, because it's such a lovely day," Jill replied. He would put a dialogue tag on every single line of dialogue. Now, that's very distracting for the reader. The best dialogue tags are the least dialogue tags when you're writing dialogue. I don't know if you've ever heard of a writer named James M. Cain. James M. Cain wrote dozens of wonderful mystery novels back in the 30s. He wrote Double Indemnity, The Postman Always Rings Twice, Mildred Pierce, File M for Murder. James M. Cain never used a dialogue tag. How do you do that? He'd use an action to set up the dialogue. So he'd say, she turned from the sink. What are you doing here? And then the other character says, the door was unlocked. And the dialogue goes back and forth from there. You know who's talking because you know who started the conversation. And that's easy to do when you have two people in dialogue. You don't need to put a tag after every single one. The first person starts, and then the next person, and then back and forth, and there you go. If you're back and forth, they're going to go for 5 or 6 or 7 exchanges. You might at some point want to put in another dialogue tag just to remind the reader where they are. But by and large, you can write a novel with very few, or in the case of James M. Cain, no dialogue tags. Okay. Anybody like Cormac McCarthy? One of my favorite authors in the world. His last novel was called Stella Maris. It came out right before he died last year. The entire novel consists of two people talking. It's a patient talking to her psychiatrist, and there's not a single dialogue tag in the entire novel. It begins. Hi, I'm Dr. Cohen. You're not the Dr. Cohen I was expecting. Sorry about that. That would be Dr. Robert Cohen. Yes, I guess there's no shortage of Dr. Cohens. And so it goes for 300 and some pages. Not a single dialogue tag. You can do that, especially in a two-person conversation. I'm reading a manuscript right now by a first-time novelist. And there are two things he does that I will talk to him about when we sit down to discuss it. One thing he does is he has characters, when they talk to each other, they use each other's name. They say, would you like to go to the lake today, Jill? Yes, Jack, that would be a wonderful thing to do. Great, Jill, I'll go load the car. In conversation, people don't use each other's names back and forth. And I don't know why a lot of first-time writers feel the compulsion to do that. Don't do that, okay? You don't need it, and it's distracting. The other thing he does is he doesn't use contractions. Instead of saying, he'll write, I will go load the car. Great. We will be there in an hour. People don't talk like that. We use contractions when we speak. I'll go load the car. Great. We'll be there in an hour. All right. So one useful thing you can do when writing dialogue to see if it really rings true is read it aloud. Read your dialogue out loud. Ask yourself, is this the way people talk to each other? And if you're saying, we will do this, or I will go do that, or they will, whatever, you're probably not, you'll see when you read it aloud that there's a better way to do it. So we use contractions. In dialogue tags, Said usually is plenty. He said, she said. Please don't use adverbs to modify your dialogue tag. She said surreptitiously, or she said loudly or quietly. If you're using an adverb to modify your tag, you're probably not using the right verb. So maybe it should be he whispered or he shouted instead of he said quietly or he said loudly or whatever. All right. Phonetic spellings. All right. If you have a character, for example, who has an accent, let's say, or speaks with some sort of patois, phonetic spellings are fine if used very sparingly. It's very distracting to the reader to be reading a West Indian person who's talking in West Indian patois throughout the novel. A simple mon once in a while will do the trick. Okay. In my novel Hush Money, my first novel, I had one of the characters was a woman who was from New Orleans. Now I could have done a New Orleans patois throughout the novel, but again, I didn't want to annoy my readers. So what I did was every once in a while she'd use the word sugar. Sure, sugar. You know, she'd say that. That's enough to remind the reader that your character is from New Orleans or from Brooklyn or whatever you want to do. So use phonetic spelling sparingly is my advice. And lastly, when people speak in conversation, they start sentences with the word and with the word but all the time. Okay. And by the way, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but blah, 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 blah. Okay. Copy editors at publishing houses love to, with their sharpened pencils and their MBA diploma on the wall, they love to correct that. They love to say, well, you shouldn't start a sentence with the word but or and. To the point where I've had to sometimes, when I submit my manuscript, I'll have a note that says, please don't correct my dialogue. Okay, my characters are speaking exactly the way I want them to speak. Don't change it. So, all right. My last of my 5 topics I wanted to cover tonight is revising the novel. All right. Revision is a big part of the writing process. I said it takes me about a year or more to write a first draft. Again, that's just my outline. I'll spend the next 6 months or so or more revising what I've written. First of all, for length. Your book should have a target length, depending on what kind of book you're writing. If you're writing general or literary fiction, not many rules apply. You can write a 130,000 word novel. You can write a 60,000 word novel. And editors aren't going to bat an eye. If you're writing category fiction, genre fiction, there are not rules, but there are conventions in terms of length. The crime novels that I write should come in somewhere around 80,000 words. That means you can do 75, you can do 85, you can even do 90 or 100. 80 to 85 is pretty much the sweet spot. I don't know what the target sweet spots are for other genres, Western, science fiction, romance, but it's easy to figure it out. Go to the library and pull some off the shelf and look at them and see how long they are. Or Google the subject. You'll see there are conventions for how long novels should be in order to be saleable. Okay. The first novel I wrote, Hush Bunny, the first draft was 150,000 words. Okay. The first agent who read that book said, you can't write a first novel of 150,000 words. That she was right. I didn't know. So I spent a good deal of time winnowing that 150,000 words down. I got it finally to about 110, which was very long for a first novel, but I was able to say that was an exception. I wouldn't recommend that you do that. Try to come in around 80 to 90 if you're writing a category novel. And that brings up another topic, which is revision. Some writers like to just get a first draft on the page, blah, get it out, write it as fast as you can. Don't try to edit it. And when you're done, then you can sit down and worry about the editing process. That works fine for many writers and maybe even most writers. I can't do that. I find that unless I'm at least reasonably satisfied with chapter one, I can't write chapter two. And if I'm not reasonably satisfied with chapter two, I can't write chapter three. So I'm constantly revising as I write. I'm constantly looping back 2 or 3 chapters every time and polishing as I go. And when I get to the end and I have my first draft, it's pretty clean. I'm usually pretty happy with it. I learned the hard way not to make each chapter perfect. And here's why. I wrote that 150,000 word first draft, and I sweated over every chapter, and I thought every chapter was perfect. And then when the editor said, "Okay, now cut 50,000 words," it was like cutting off appendages from my body. I mean, it pained me to cut a chapter out of the book because I'd spent so much time making sure that the language was just perfect. So it's a mistake to do that. Write your first draft so that it's good enough to satisfy you and to keep you in the story and keep you moving forward. If you can do it with a sloppy first draft, that's great. If you have to, like me, you have to be at least a serviceable first draft, fine. If you have to cut a chapter or two, it won't kill you. Critique groups. Most writers that I know, especially at the beginning, belong to critique groups, which means they get together with other writers and they meet in person or online or whatever, maybe once a month, and they share their writing. And all critique groups have their own procedures and protocols. For example, I was invited to join a critique group when I first started writing. And the way they did it, they'd get together. Each person, the 5 or 6 in the group, would read a chapter or two that they'd written. The others would discuss it, kind of pick it apart, make suggestions, and the next person would read, and the others, So that's a process by which you can get third parties to critique your group, your book in progress. As I say, most writer friends that I have do it. Some who've been successful have a dozen books out in the world. They're still doing it with their original critique group because it worked for them and they're sticking with it. I could never be in a critique group. I attended one once and I concluded it just wasn't for me. For me, I like to sit down and close the door and write the entire first draft myself and have it to a point where I think it's ready to be read before I let anybody else read it. That just works for me. It occurs to me, if you're in a critique group, boy, you better respect the other people because, if it's 5 first-time novelists all trying to teach each other to write, who's to say that their opinion is going to be meaningful to you, or you're going to change what you think is right because somebody else told you that they don't like it. What I do is when I'm finished my first draft, I send it out to 3 or 4 what we call beta readers, 3 or 4 first readers before it goes to the editor. My agent is usually one. My brother is one. His daughter, my niece is one. And my wife is one. So they read it. They give me their feedback. If they say that they don't like something or they make a suggestion and I disagree with it, I'll usually overrule them. If I like the way it is, I'll ignore that. If 2 or more of them say the same thing, then by gosh, I know I've got a problem and I should address that issue. So beta readers can be very helpful. The novelist Neil Gaiman has a great line. He said, when 2 or more beta readers tell you you have a problem, you've got a problem. When they tell you how to solve it, they're almost, he said, when they tell you you have a problem, they're almost always right. When they tell you how to fix it, they're almost always wrong. And I think that's true too. So if they've identified a problem, by all means, address it. Not necessarily the way they suggest you address it, but you know your novel better than they do. You know that you can make a tweak here and a tweak here, and that'll solve that problem down there. And oftentimes, what looks like a big problem can be solved very simply by making a few tweaks here and there, and you'll address that problem. here's something that I recommend highly if you can do it. If you're writing on deadline because you're under contract and you have to deliver a manuscript by a certain date, you may not have this luxury. But if you can take your completed first draft and put it in a drawer and ignore it for a month or 2 months, and then go back to it and read it again with fresh eyes, boy, there's nothing better than reading your own writing after some time off with fresh eyes. You'll be surprised at how the chapter that you thought was just perfect, now you say, that needs to be fixed. That needs to be fixed. Great stuff. I had the luxury of doing that with my last novel, The Chimera Club. I wrote the whole novel. I put it away for a period of 3 or 4 months. And then I pulled it out again. And boy, that revision process was great. I'm so happy with the way it turned out, mostly because I was looking at it both as a writer the first time and as a reader with fresh eyes a few months later. Once you're published, you're going to be dealing with an editor. And your editor is going to have suggestions, okay, for changes that he wants to see made. My first novel, Hush Money, Peter Joseph, I mentioned, was my editor at St. Martin's. He loved the novel, but there was an ending that he didn't like. Not the very ending, but kind of a setup that set up the ending. And boy, I disagree with him on that. I liked it much better the way I'd written it than the way he suggested I write it. But I was a first-time novelist, and he was my editor, and so by God, I made the change, and I regretted it ever since. I think if I ever rewrote that novel, I'd put my original ending back in because I think it was that much better. So you have to, at some point, decide whether you're going to accede to suggestions made to you by your editor, or whether you feel strongly enough about it that you want to push back a little bit. Depends on your relationship with your editor. Depends on how strongly you feel about the particular issue. But there is a certain back and forth that goes on between writer and editor. And yeah, you can push back. You can say, no, I'm not going to do that. One thing I've noticed, if you read very successful novelists, you'll notice that each successive book seems to get fatter and fatter and fatter. I mentioned Nelson DeVille, one of my favorite mystery writers, but I've noticed his books get fatter and flabbier with each iteration. And the reason is because I think, with the first novel, I'm sure he listened to what his editor said, and, he made those cuts. By the third book, when he was an international bestseller, the editor couldn't tell him what to do, and he wasn't going to listen anyway. So the books just got fatter and fatter and flabbier and flabbier. Anyway, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. We can talk about other things. We can do some Q&A. I saw there were some things coming up on the screen.